Peter's port to the west. Peter's journey to Europe was a success. He learned all about the countries of the west, but it was also a failure, because he couldn't convince England and Holland to join him in a war against the Turks. Peter owned the port of Azov, but he still couldn't get into the Mediterranean, and now Peter had 86 warships and nowhere to go. Peter knew that if he kept on fighting the Turks without help, he would probably lose. He studied his maps, looking for another clear path to Europe, but the only other way to send his ships to Europe would be to launch them into the Baltic Sea. Unfortunately, Sweden owned the shores of the Baltic, so Peter declared war on Sweden. Sweden's neighbor, Denmark-Norway, joined with him. Once, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had all been ruled by one king, but Sweden had broken away and now was growing larger, stronger, and greedier. The people of Denmark-Norway hoped that together with Russia they would beat off the swelling Swedish Empire. Peter believed that he could beat Sweden in a few short weeks. After all, the Swedish army was led by their 19-year-old king, Charles XII. Charles was known for wild parties and reckless stunts, such as making his whole court go out and hunt bears, armed only with wooden pitchforks. Peter didn't think that this noisy boy would be able to plan and carry out a disciplined military campaign. Once again, Peter was wrong. His war with Sweden, the Great Northern War, began in 1700 and lasted for the next 21 years. The war started badly for Peter. He started off to attack Narva, a Swedish city on the eastern banks of the Baltic, but his army was hauling so much cannons and siege weapons that the journey took months. Meanwhile, Charles invaded Denmark and scared the Danish into surrendering, and when Peter's army finally reached Narva, the cannons wouldn't work properly. Russian gunpowder was so bad that cannonballs often staggered out of the cannons and plopped harmlessly to earth. Other times, the gunpowder overfired and blew up entire cannons. While the Russians struggled with their cannons, Peter decided to return to Moscow to check on how the government was working in his absence. Just hours after he rode off, the Russian army learned that a huge Swedish army, under Charles's command, was only 6 miles away from Narva. They scrambled frantically to prepare for battle. But just as the Swedes came into view, a huge snow squall opened right above the Russians. In the blinding, violent cloud of snow, the Russians couldn't get into line, or even face the right direction. The cavalry rode the wrong direction, fell into the nearby Narva River, and drowned. The general and his officers galloped toward the Swedes, doing their best to surrender as quickly as possible. Charles XII was delighted with his victory. He ordered a medal made, celebrating the triumph. The medal showed Peter the Great running away, holding a handkerchief to his eyes, which were squirting out streams of tears. The Russian army retreated, but Charles decided not to chase them. Winter was coming, and he knew that his army might freeze to death in the icy Russian wilderness, so the Swedish troops started to wait out the long winter. Meanwhile, Peter returned to prepare his own army for spring. He ordered new cannons forged and ships repaired. He drafted more soldiers for his army and taught them to fight with both guns and bayonets. By the time the fighting began again, the Russians were strong enough to hold off the Swedes. Battle followed battle. Peter the Great took a personal role in the war, traveling from front to front, leading attacks, sailing on warships, and even helping to repair the ships in the shipyards. In 1702, Peter finally managed to capture a small Swedish fortress on the Neva River, which led into the Baltic Sea. He still couldn't sail into the Baltic, which was guarded by the Swedish Navy, but he was sure that he would win the Baltic from the Swedes. Then ships could sail from the little Neva fortress to Europe. The banks of the Neva River could be Russia's window to the west. So Peter planned out a brand new city on the shores of the Neva. He named his city St. Petersburg after his patron saint, Peter. The land where St. Petersburg would be built was swampy and muddy, filled with water birds, reeds, and mosquitoes. There were no trees for lumber and no stones for foundations. There were no buildings except for Peter's new royal palace, a little hut with 3 rooms, no stove, and rickety wooden walls painted to look like brick. But Peter wasn't discouraged. In his imagination, he could already see the skyline of a great city, as great as any European city. As the war with Sweden dragged on, Peter ordered every soldier who could be spared to work on building St. Petersburg. He forced peasants and Swedish prisoners of war to work on it too, and paid them so little that they had to steal and beg in order to have enough to eat. Every piece of wood and every stone had to be dragged to St. Petersburg from far away, and there were no wheelbarrows, so the workers carried loads of stones in the laps of their long shirts. While Peter built, Charles XII plotted his strategy. 6 years after Peter began work on St. Petersburg, Charles invaded Russia. The Russian army fell back. The Swedes chased them deep into Russia. But it was already fall, and cold weather threatened. Charles's soldiers began to whisper about the horrors of a Russian winter. It would become so cold, they told each other, that birds would die flying through the air and hit the ground like stones. Charles, excited by the prospect of victory, told his men to go on. The Russian army kept on retreating until the only shelter nearby was a tiny walled town with one small door. And then the temperature plummeted. One of the coldest spells in memory had struck the Russian plains. The Swedes clustered toward the narrow door of the town, but it took 3 days for the whole army to file through. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 soldiers froze to death. Frostbite took the noses, ears, fingers, and toes of thousands more. The whole time the Russians were camped safely nearby. Their heavy furs and warm boots and their winter-proof tents kept them safe. When the weakened Swedes finally met the Russians in battle, the Russians were triumphant. 10,000 Swedish soldiers were killed or captured. The Russians ruled the field. Charles XII refused to surrender. The war sputtered on, but 4 years later, Charles was killed by a bullet during a meaningless battle. Without Charles, the Swedes gave up. They surrendered the eastern shore of the Baltic to Peter. Now Peter's window to the west was wide open. For the next few years of his reign, Peter worked hard to make Russia as rich as any Western nation. He built canals, factories, salt works, iron mills, and mines. He brought European craftsmen to Russia to teach Russians how to make cloth, lacquerware, and other goods. He worked hard on St. Petersburg, which he declared to be his new capital city. In 1714, 12 years after the city began, a Western diplomat sniffed that the city was no more than a heap of villages linked together. But only 10 years later, in 1724, the same diplomat marveled that St. Petersburg had become a wonder of the world, filled with magnificent palaces. But Peter had only a short time to enjoy his city. In that same year, 1724, he was sailing to visit a Russian factory when a nearby boat ran aground on a sandbar and began to sink. Peter leapt into the icy water to pull the sailors to safety. The icy water brought on fever and illness. Peter never recovered. He died while trying to write down the name of his successor. When Peter died, the Empire of Russia stretched from Archangel in the north over past the Ural Mountains in the east, down to the Caspian Sea in the south, over to the borders of Poland and Sweden on the west. Moscow and St. Petersburg had become cities filled with Western merchants and diplomats. Russian diplomats visited every European court. Peter had made Russia larger, but even more important, he had made Russia part of Europe. No wonder he became known as Peter the Great.